Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. The show, as you all know, brings you the libertarian perspective on the issues of the day, and I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
It's great to be here and see you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, and if you want to learn more about FFF, you can come to fff.org, where we have a wealth of videos like this one, Libertarian Angle, and articles. We publish a weekly article by Richard, my daily blog, and a number of other articles and videos and podcasts and so forth. Okay, Richard, let's continue our series on your favorite books as a libertarian and as an Austrian economist. We began with the books of Ayn Rand, and then we in the last segment we talked about the books of Ludwig von Mises. And so what do you say that this week we talk about the books of Friedrich Hayek? And
Sounds great.
Friedrich Hayek, of course, was a libertarian economist. He won the Nobel Prize. And he's really one of the shining stars of the libertarian movement.
Absolutely.
And he's got a wealth of books and articles. Why don't you give us a little encapsulation of Hayek's life and the books that you think are most influential and the ones that actually played a big role in your intellectual development?
Well, Hayek was born in 1899 in Austria, obviously during the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. His father was a rather well-known scientist himself, a botanist that got Hayek interested in the sciences. But as a young man, when he was only about 16 years old, he volunteered for the army during the First World War. He saw action and service on the Italian front, and then returned after the war had ended in November 1918. In fact, we're just about a month away from the anniversary of the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War. And he got accepted at the university. And for war veterans, there was a sort of an accelerated program where you could do your studies and earn your doctoral degree in just a handful of years. The upshot of it was, in 1921, if I remember correctly, he earned his first doctoral degree. He had two, Doctor of Jurisprudence. He was interested somewhat in economics, but you studied economics as Mises had himself 20 years earlier, more than that. You earned your economics degree or studies through the law faculty. So like Mises, Hayek had been trained as a professional lawyer and was very well versed in the law. And then he went on to earn a second PhD at the University of Vienna 2 years later, 1923, in political science. Now, it was at this time that he met Ludwig von Mises. The upshot of it is that when he graduated, he needed a job. And his professor, a leading Austrian economist named Friedrich von Hayek, wrote him a letter of recommendation to Mises. Now, Mises, when the war ended, returned to his position with the Austrian or Vienna Chamber of Commerce, but he also took on another task at an Office of Accounts. Mises was responsible in this office set up by the League of Nations to settle pre-war international debts and obligations of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that now had to be divvied up among what we call the successor states, so New Czechoslovakia, New Hungary, New Small Austria, et cetera, et cetera. And jobs were few and far between, and so Hayek wrote this letter of recommendation for Hayek to Mises. And so according to the story that Hayek often told, he comes into Mises's office, and Mises is reading the letter and says, well, Professor Wieser says that you're one of his best students. So why have I never seen you in my university seminar? And Hayek made some type of an excuse. But it turns out that Hayek later said that he had sat in. In fact, he had signed up and sat in one class of Mises's course at the University of Vienna and said, this guy is too much of a radical, wild-eyed, laissez-faire advocate. This guy is nuts. because at the time Hayek was a moderate socialist, you see, not a Marxist, but sort of a squishy moderate socialist. But as Hayek said, it was in his time working with Mises at that office of accounts, in which he had daily contact work with him. And then for the next 10 years before Hayek went to the London School of Economics for a position, as he said, in almost daily and intimate contact with Ludwig von Mises for nearly a decade, no one had more influence and impact on my outlook, my thinking, and my views than him. And that, in fact, all my major contributions had their inspiration in his own earlier contributions. And that what Hayek said is that he agreed, he came to see the logic and rationality of Mises's conclusions, but that his own contribution came from the fact that he often didn't always see or agree with the chain of logic by which Mises had reached that conclusion. And therefore he rethought monetary theory and the business cycle. He rethought, the argument about socialism and the nature of the market order, not in contradiction or disagreement with Mises, but sort of scratching his head and saying, okay, I see Mises's argument, but maybe if we sort of added this subtlety or approached it this way, this would be an enriched way of reaching the same conclusion that Mises has shown, the light for. And that's how Hayek got into economics. And in fact, during his early years, the late second half of the 1920s, throughout the 1930s and into the 1940s, what Hayek was most famous for was as a monetary and business cycle theorist. In 1928, he had delivered a series of lectures, which was then published as a book called Monetary Theory and the Trade Cycle, in which he took Mises's ideas and tried to show why Federal Reserve policy in the 1920s, by attempting to stabilize the general price level, was creating a situation of fundamental destabilization that likely was to set off a depression looking down the road. He was then invited to give a series of lectures at the London School of Economics in January of 1931, invited by an intellectual protege of Mises's. He'd never studied with Mises, a British economist named Lionel Robbins. And those lectures were then published later in 1931 called Prices and Production, which led to Hayek being invited to be first a visiting and then a permanent professor at the London School of Economics, a position which he held until around 1948 or 49. It was in this capacity, writing in the English-speaking world, that without a doubt in the 1930s, Hayek became the leading and most prominent critic and opponent of John Maynard Keynes. He had first written a lengthy two-part review essay of Keynes's earlier book, A Treatise on Money, which had come out in 1930. And of all the reviews and essays written about that earlier Keynes book, it has been generally thought by historians of economic thought that Hayek's lengthy two-part review was a devastating coup de grace, that Keynes was demolished. And in fact, shortly after that, Keynes said, well, I guess I've decided I don't agree with my own book, and I'm going back to the drawing board, which then led to Keynes spending 5 years to develop the ideas that became his famous book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, which appeared in February 1936 and became the basis of, quote, Keynesian economics. And throughout the 1930s, both before and even after the general theory came out, Hayek's Austrian theory of the business cycle, that the business cycle, the bust of and suffering high unemployment was not the result of government, was not the result of the market, but was due to government intervention and manipulation of money, credit, and interest rates that brought about, as Mises had argued earlier, though Hayek in his own words and sort of refinements of it, bring about distortions and imbalances between savings and investment that sets the stage for an economy to face a big fall. And like Mises, Hayek argued that once you're into the recession or the economic downturn, it doesn't necessarily have to be either long or severe. It requires leaving the market alone to rebalance itself, re-coordinate itself through adjustments of supply and demand, prices, wages, reallocations of resources that have been misallocated during the boom years due to the monetary mischief of the central bank, and that the economy can return to full employment and sustainable growth if government keeps its hand out. Of course, the great debate in certainly the first half of the 1930s was, oh, the market has failed, oh, unemployment is prolonged and severe, we need government. And throughout those years, Hayek basically took the same position as Mises, though from his perch at the London School of Economics, that the best policy is to allow the market to work. The other aspect of Hayek at this time is, again, taking up the torch that Mises had first developed in the 1920s. Hayek began responding to the British advocates of socialism and socialist central planning. He first did this in a book called Collectivist Economic Planning, which came out in 1935. It is primarily a collection of translations of essays in other European languages, including Mises's famous 1920 essay on economic calculation in the socialist commonwealth, where Mises first made his own first challenge against socialism. But Hayek then sandwiched those translated essays with a long introductory essay and a long concluding essay, in which he summarized the debate and then extended it further to, quote, the modern times of the 1930s socialists in the lengthy concluding essays. And then, so therefore, through this, he became known as one of the leading English world's critics of socialism. He came to criticize, the modified version of this, of market socialism, developed by a Polish economist named Oskar Lange, and he refuted that as well. And then finally, in 1945, he wrote his famous essay. It was published in the American Economic Review, the most prestigious professional economics journal both then and now, in the September 1945 issue, called The Use of Knowledge in Society. And basically what Hayek argues in this is that matching the division of labor is a division of knowledge, and that this division of knowledge is dispersed, decentralized, and divided in all the minds of all the members of the society in many subtle and intricate and complementary forms. And that if we are to benefit from what all the others in society know that we do not possess, but whose knowledge could benefit us through the exchanges of the marketplace, there must be a mechanism by which we can communicate with those, and those can communicate with us, to share the necessary information so those with special and decentralized and unique knowledge can apply it in ways that benefit others in society. And that becomes his case for the free competitive pricing system. It's not necessary for all of us to know each other personally, or the details of why we want to do things, or the resources we desire, or the products we want. It is sufficient if we minimally communicate the information that we have demands and the values we place upon them in terms of the prices we'll pay for both finished goods, or on the producer side, the competing demands of other businessmen to use the same resources that we as an entrepreneur might find it useful to apply. And then prices serve as the calculating tools, as Mises argued, input prices, output prices, to decide, is it profitable? Would this be loss-making? Would this be more profitable? Would this be less profitable? Would this combination of resources to make the product minimize my expenses better than this combination of resources? And that economic calculation, which Mises used as the basis of his critique of socialism, do away with property and prices and markets, and you have no tool for economic calculation, for economic rationality. Hayek complemented that by saying, and what enables that rationality is the ability to use their own knowledge and communicate what they know and what they need to know with others through the competitive price mechanism. This article is now of economics. Some other lengthy and detailed book called The Pure Theory of Capital, which came out in 1941. But basically, in the post-World War II years, following 1945, he not only, but primarily, became increasingly concerned with the logic of these economic arguments about freedom, decentralized knowledge, the freedom of association among individuals, the institutional requirements for a free society, to extend it into wider elements of social philosophy. And the upshot of this were two books that he worked on for many years. The first one, The Constitution of Liberty, came out in 1960, and then a trilogy called Law, Legislation, and Liberty, which appeared over several years between 1976 and 1973 and 1979 as separate volumes, 1, 2, and 3. Now, again, let me what I consider one or two of the essential points here.
Now, in my humble opinion, in Part 1 of the Constitution of Liberty offers one of the most subtle arguments for freedom ever penned. And that is, freedom is important not because of what we know, but because of what we don't know. We want others to be free like ourselves, so we may take advantage of knowledge and possibilities and potentials of which we know nothing, but which others may have the ability to do. So unless we allow our fellow human beings to be free and create the opportunities for them to have the incentive to use their knowledge to our benefit through the competitive market, we will be poorer in many ways, culturally, economically, materially, socially, than if all men were free and bound together through the exchanges of the market to use their knowledge in ways that will benefit us. Part 2 is on the rule of law. It too is a brilliant analysis of the importance of the evolution and the institutions and nature of impartial rule of law. And then Part 3 is perhaps the weakest part of the book. It's basically, to be honest, his compromises and inconsistencies concerning the welfare state. And then finally, before I talk too much about doing this, law, legislation, liberty has 3 elements. To explain the idea of a spontaneous order of society versus a planned order imposed by government. Volume 2 is called The Mirage of Social Justice. In this volume, Hayek says everyone talks about social justice, redistributive justice, but what does this mean? Like a mirage, when you see it from afar, it looks like it's clear, it's obvious, it's outlined, but when you try to get close to the mirage, you realize it's all an illusion. It disappears. And then once you ask the question, what is social justice? What is a fair distribution of wealth? What do people really deserve if you're going to do it on some notion of merit? And they realize there is no objective and benchmark standard. And yet the state would be doing this, and it requires the state, therefore, to arbitrarily and capriciously, guided by either its own, that is the people in government, doing it by their own arbitrary standards of what they view as just and good and right, or it's done by the corruption of special interest groups using the state for their own plundering purposes and justified, well, it's my just deserts, I deserve this, it's socially just. And then finally, Volume 3 of Lord's Legislation of Liberty asks the question, how can we redesign representative democratic government so as to not be as susceptible to the plundering and special interest politicking that it is today? And he sets up sort of a model government. But those are his major contributions. And one other thing, Jacob, if I may be allowed to just continue for a few minutes on a personal note. I had the privilege and honor to spend a good part of 2 summers with Hayek. And that was in the summers of 1975 and 1977 as a young research fellow at the Institute for Humane Studies, IHS, when they were headquartered out in Menlo Park, California. Fortunately, fortuitously, both of those summers, Hayek was also in residence as a senior fellow at the Institute. And both of those summers, his office was only a door or 2 down from. And as I like to tell the story, and I think I've said it more than once, I suppose, in our previous LAs that we've done, but nonetheless, since we're talking about Hayek, my view was I was in my mid-20s, right? I'm a young kid, and he's in his sort of late 70s, mid-70s. And from when you're 20 and you look at someone 70, it seems like they're ancient, right? Like Methuselah. And I had this attitude, any day Hayek could not show up because he died, right? Oh, God, he's ancient. And so I figured, well, he knows something. He knows all this knowledge about Austrian economics and the Austrian school. So I got myself on a mission that at least 2 or 3 days a week, I would go into his office if he was there, and I would talk to him for at least a couple hours each time to sort of suck every bit of information out of his mind. The old Vienna days with Ludwig von Mises, his battle with Keynes and the socialists in the interwar years of the 30s and 40s, how he came to his ideas and everything. And I have to say, for someone who must have seemed to him as a really irritating young pest, because he was like, but Professor Hayek, gracious, kind, patient, deferential, willing to share his knowledge, often amusingly self-deprecating, making fun of himself about his failures and disappointments in fighting Keynes and the socialists. He referred, I remember one time, to a debate that he had with the famous British economist Arthur Pigou
one of the fathers of what's called modern welfare economics. And he said in passing, he says, "Yes, I remember the debate well. It was one of my most famous defeats." And he was like that. And so it was a delightful and charming man. If you can have an image in your mind of what you think a Nobel Prize winner should be, that was Friedrich Hayek. And then I can only mention one other thing, is that that was a distraction when I was talking to him. He had been a lifelong pipe smoker, but his doctor told him he had to give up the pipe, but he needed his nicotine fix. So what he would do, Jacob, he would sit there and he had a snuff box, sniffing the snuff. And then, of course, all the little shavings would start dribbling down onto his mustache. And I would be distracted from what he was saying. Is that watching it, is it going to land on his tie, his shirt, his pants? I mean, it was, it was like, where is the next shred of that stuff going to fall? So it's kind of hard to pay attention while I'm watching this. But it was a delightful time. And I must say I met him one more time. And that was in 1980. It was my first trip to Europe. And I wrote to him that I was going to be passing through Freiburg, where he was then living. And I arrived early by train, had a few hours to kill. And then I met him at his office. And he very graciously spent about 3 hours with me and took me for a delightful lunch. And all I can say is that he is one of the great thinkers and the great men in our times. And I can't resist this, if we can get it on the camera. This is a picture of Hayek and me from an Austrian economics conference at the University of Hartford in June of 1975 that was sort of arranged and organized by Dom Armentano, a well-known free market economist, and funded by Institute for Humane Studies. And what I like to say is, please notice, Hayek has turned away from me and is covering his ear. Oh, no, not that Ebeling guy again. No, anything but that. Not that Ebeling guy.
Well, that's sort of the way I feel sometimes.
Of course you do. Of course you do. So I like having that photo with actually one of my true intellectual heroes.
Well, that's an absolutely tremendous and fascinating encapsulation of Hayek's ideas and some of his books. And as you point out, Hayek not only was a devastating critic of socialism and the managed economy, and of course reflected by his famous book The Road to Serfdom that I think was published in 1944. That he's known for this. He's shown that socialism is not a workable system. It just doesn't function. It doesn't deliver the goods. But as you also point out, he was also absolutely fantastic at showing the positive aspects of the opposite system, the free market system, or what he called the spontaneous order. So that instead of having government officials centrally plan economic activity, he showed the virtues of individuals planning their own individual lives and then harmonizing their interests with other people from around the world, and oftentimes producing a result that nobody plans, a remarkable result, inventions and so forth. Now, you mentioned the Constitution of Liberty, which is one of his major books, and that book had a major impact on me as well, especially given my law background. As you know, I started out as a trial attorney, and I practiced law for many, many years before joining the Libertarian movement full time. So when I read Constitution of Liberty, it had a powerful impact on me. I remembered, when I discovered the book in my early 30s or late 20s, I would just pore over it, studying every footnote and seeing who his references were. And one of the big principles that he enunciated and he carefully explained to me was the rule of law. That, people think, oh, well, the rule of law just means that you have to obey the law. Well, that's not what it means. What Hayek is saying is that a necessary prerequisite for a free society is the principle that the government has to set the rules in advance. So in other words, if there's no drug laws, but the president says, well, I just think it's a bad thing for people to be taking drugs, go and arrest that guy and put him in jail, that violates the rule of law, because people have the right to know what the rules are in advance. Okay, so you have a drug law that prohibits drug consumption or drug possession. That satisfies the rule of law. But as Hayek points out, while the rule of law is a necessary prerequisite for a free society, it's not a sufficient prerequisite, because we all know that drug laws themselves violate the principles of liberty. So that you then move into the substantive aspect of what does a free society entail. But one of the biggest disappointments for me, Richard, when I got to the end of the Constitution of Liberty, was Hayek's defense of a minimal welfare state. I mean, I think this was a disaster for the libertarian movement, because here you have this Nobel Prize winning libertarian economist that is essentially saying, well, the free market's fantastic, the spontaneous order is fantastic, but you need this minimal amount of coercion because you can't trust people totally 100% in a free society. And when I got to that, I mean, that was a huge disappointment, and that's why one of the reasons why I've always been more attracted to Mises, because Mises really had this uncompromising attitude, principled attitude toward liberty that I think sometimes is not found in Hayek.
Yeah, in fact, when the Constitution of Liberty came out, Mises wrote a review of it. I think it was for the Freeman. And he, too, like yourself, praised Part 1 on the spontaneous order and Part 2 on the rule of law, but took Hayek to task for his compromises, contradictions, and inconsistencies concerning aspects of the welfare state in Part 3. In fact, I hope that my comments have expressed or conveyed to the viewers and listeners that I hold Hayek in great high esteem as a thinker, as an individual, but his willingness to compromise on this, and this was not anything new. In the 1930s, or even in The Road to Serfdom of 1944, and I didn't mention The Road to Serfdom, it's probably his greatest popular book, his critique of why planning and a planned society always tends to lead to terrible tyranny. Those compromises, was like the foot in the door to justify and rationalize. Well, if a minimal welfare state, then why not more? And how minimal is it to be? And who decides the minimalness of it, or whether the minimalness should be wider and more extensive? And so, unfortunately, this is an instance that once you compromise the principle, it tends to be open-ended. Another economist who suffered from the same thing, who I also greatly admire, was the German free market economist Wilhelm Röpke. He's brilliant, he's eloquent, he's very principled. He was a courageous man. He faced up to the Nazis and Nazi thugs, in fact, after Hitler came to power, for speaking out after Hitler became the head of the government. But he too believed in the sort of the middle way, or a third way, of free markets, but a sort of minimal welfare state as opposed to socialism. And then later on, he said, well, the problem is the welfare state has no limits. Well, yes, it has no limits, but you've opened the door for that unlimited welfare state by rationalizing that minimal safety nets. And this is sort of like a tension, and sort of trying to square the round hole in a way that is not. You either believe, as I think certainly you and I do, and I hope some of our viewers and listeners, that consistently the case for liberty must be based on absolute freedom of association. That if a state is to exist, it should only be for the protection and the securing of our individual rights to life, liberty, and honestly acquired property. But that all other aspects of human existence and association should be peaceful and voluntary, including charity, philanthropy, associative work to help those who we believe are deserving of our assistance, of a properly understood benevolence based upon philosophy or religion. But that once the state starts doing this, it's the camel's nose in the tent, as the phrase says, that before you know it, the camel is inside the tent and there is no more tent and only the camel. And that's the dilemma we have. At what point do you end the welfare state and say it grows this big but no further? And you can't always be sure that you will be in charge of the welfare state. That's others will not try to expand it for their own either ideological or self-interested special favoritism reasons. So that you either believe that the state should not be involved, and rely upon the free institutions of voluntarism that even de Tocqueville talks about as one of the shining institutions of the America that he visited in the 1830s, or you follow a path that has the open-ended growth of government that we see today.
Yeah, it really boggles the mind. But here's this brilliant man. I mean, obviously brilliant, and appreciates and understands and embraces the concept of freedom and free markets. But yet he can't see the moral objection to forcing someone at any level, minimal or large or whatever, forcing someone to care for someone else, which is what a minimal welfare state or a so-called safety net involves. And then the second part of it is that he understands his whole concept is based on the free market works, socialism doesn't work. And yet the welfare state reflects a doubt about that. It's saying, well, you know, at a certain level, we just can't trust freedom in the free market because it doesn't work. But you and I do trust that freedom and free market. You don't need a safety net because the free market really does work. There's not going to be people dying in the streets because there's always going to be people who are willing to help out others, with the understanding that this is what freedom entails, the right to say no as well as the right to say yes. In the waning moments we have, Richard, so what books in particular would you recommend people to read Hayek? Because there's so many. Give us like the top 5 that you would recommend.
Well, certainly in terms of the wide breadth of freedom versus tyranny, there remains his classic book, The Road to Serfdom. Published during the Second World War, it is highly readable. Of course, he's using the examples of Nazi Germany and, to a lesser extent, the Soviet Union as to the dangers of where these statist policies lead, tyranny and totalitarian oppression. But the underlying message of the danger of these policies taken to one logical step further and further and further is still as timely as when he wrote that book. The Constitution of Liberty, again, particularly part 1 and 2 on spontaneous order and the rule of law. And I would also, if the student is interested or the reader is interested in more of his technical economics, there would be his classic book, Prices and Production. But in his later years, the also interesting work he did, he gave up the ghost in believing that government should manage money at all. And in 1976, he published a monograph called Denationalization of Money, in which he calls for the separation of government from the monetary system. He calls for private competitive banking of a particular sort. And that has that helped create an entire subfield of monetary and banking theory on free banking. The 2 leading proponents of that in the U.S. are Lawrence H. White and George Selgin. So that is inspirational as well. But almost anything that you read by Hayek is timely. Oh, I should mention one other thing in this. For the interested student, interested in understanding the nature of the market process versus government planning or regulation, I highly recommend the essays in his collection Individualism and Economic Order, which first came out in 1948. That includes his 3 classic essays against socialist central planning. It includes his essay on the use of knowledge in society, the complementary essay on the meaning of competition, and the lead essay in the book called Individualism, True and False. What does true individualism mean in terms of society and its institutions? So I would highly recommend a good number of those essays as well.
That's a great list. And I'm glad you mentioned about the denationalization of money because, you know, while people debate should there be a gold standard or a paper money standard, Hayek takes it to an entirely different level and says, how about just letting the market decide this? You know, just let the market decide what money is, which means let individuals decide what money is. And of course, that's the real solution to this. Instead of having government involving itself with the monetary sphere, have a separation of money in the state. And we might mention your book, your FFF book, Monetary Central Planning and the State, that I think draws on a lot of what Hayek says.
Absolutely. It's basically a theme of it. And if I can sort of advertise this here for a second, here is the cover of the book, Monetary Central Planning in the State, as an ebook, kindly and appreciatively published and sponsored by the Future Freedom Foundation. And this is available on Amazon for the lowly price of $2 or $3.
Yeah, in fact, if we can stretch the time for the show, why don't you tell our viewers the latest news about monetary central planning in the state?
Yes. And that is that within the next month or two, there will appear an actual hard copy version in Chinese, published in mainland China. About a year ago, I was approached by this, if I would be willing to consent to having it translated into Chinese. And just this past week, I was attending one of the annual conferences of the Mont Pelerin Society meeting, an organization set up of like-minded friends of freedom, set up in 1947 under Hayek's auspices, his leadership. And I met the young Chinese gentleman who actually has translated the book. And he has told me that within the next month or two, it will actually appear in print in mainland China, the People's Republic of China, in which the interested Chinese student or layman or professor can read about the Austrian theory of money in the business cycle, the Austrian critique of Keynesianism in the setting of critiquing the Keynesian argument about the Great Depression, and then in the second part of the book, the case for free private competitive banking as opposed to central banking. And that now will be available for 1.4 billion people to have a chance to read.
Yeah, phenomenal that FFF's radical philosophy, at least to a certain extent, is going to be read by people in this communist regime. Kind of interesting. All right, Richard, we're out of time. Greatly enjoyed the visit as always, and I look forward to talking to you and continuing this series and future Libertarian Angles.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us.
Yep, thanks for tuning in. Come and visit us at fff.org, and we'll see you all next week.